In this video, we're going to show you a really quick and easy method to get your suspension set up absolutely dialed before you even hit the trails. This includes setting up your sag, the progression of your suspension, and the rebound. All in all, this should take about 10 minutes. Today we're going to be using a full suspension bike, but if you've got a hardtail, you can use basically the same method, but obviously ignoring the bits that pertain to the rear suspension. So you're going to want to find yourself a nice open space to do this, somewhere without too many cars. Make sure you're wearing the kit that you normally wear for riding. So if you normally wear a big heavy rucksack, you're going to want to be wearing that for this. Also make sure your tires are pumped up properly, and make sure that any climb switches or lockouts are set to the off position or fully open. The first thing to do is to set your sag. That's the amount of travel your suspension uses just under your body weight. And it gives you a really good indication of how firm the suspension is relative to how much you weigh. We're going to start by measuring the sag on the rear shock. Now you can do this stood up in the pedals, but it's much easier to do it consistently, sat down in the saddle with the saddle dropped. The first thing to do is to move the rubber O-ring towards the shock body, and then you want to gradually lower all of your weight onto the shock without bouncing. Make sure your feet come off the ground so that all of your weight is on the saddle. And then you want to look at how much travel your shock has used by the position of the O-ring. When measuring sag this way, it's usually best to aim for 30% sag on the rear. Now, if you have RockShox suspension, the percentage sag is clearly marked on the shock stanchion, so you can just read it off. Other suspension manufacturers don't have these markings printed on the shock stanchion. So what you're going to have to do is measure the amount of travel used and then work that out as a percentage of the total shock travel, which you can usually find written on the side of the shock, or you can find it out from the bike manufacturer. So if you've got more than 30% sag, you'll need to add some air to the shock to compensate. And if you've got less than 30% sag, you'll need to remove some air. To do this, just unscrew the dust cap on the air valve and attach a shock pump. Then either pump a bit more air in to make it firmer, or release a bit of air to make it softer using the bleed valve on the shock pump. Make a note of the pressure that's now in the shock in case you need to make further adjustments, and then remove the shock pump from the shock. Once you've adjusted the pressure in your shock, it's important to compress the shock a few times just to balance the amount of pressure in the positive and the negative air chamber. Measure the sag again and then repeat the process until you hit that 30% mark. Now that we've set the sag in the shock, it's time to move on to the fork. Most forks these days have an air pressure chart, and that's a really good way of getting your pressure pretty much correct straight away. But if your fork doesn't have one of these, or you want to double check, you can measure the sag of the fork too. As with the shock, the first thing to do is to push the O-ring down to the bottom of the stanchion, then starting sat down in the saddle, set off in the seated position, and then gradually come up to the attack position so as to settle the fork naturally into its travel. Making sure not to bounce on the fork and compress it any further, gently move your weight back off of the fork and come to a gentle stop. Under this test, you're looking for 25% sag. So if you haven't got that, as with the fork, just connect the shock pump and make any adjustments necessary. Then remove the shock pump, compress the fork a few times to balance the air between the two chambers, and measure the sag again. Having the sag correct means that the spring rate or air pressure in your suspension should match your weight. Now we're going to set the progression of your suspension. That's basically how much force it takes to bottom out your suspension and use full travel. Now, while the sag is just based on how heavy you are, the progression should be based on how strong you are as a rider, basically how much force you can put through the bike. To test this, what you want to do is find a piece of flat ground and basically bounce on the suspension as hard as you physically can without actually leaving the ground. Concentrate on the fork and the shock separately and push down with an explosive effort as hard as you possibly can, and then measure how much travel you've used using the O-rings. With the shock, you want to be using about 90% of the travel under this test, but you don't want to be able to bottom out just in the car park. With the fork, you're looking for sort of 80 or 90% travel under this test. If you're using too much travel, you might want to add a volume spacer or two to your suspension. Check the manufacturer's instructions on how to do that. Conversely, if you're using nowhere near full travel on the fork or the shock, it may be that your suspension is too firm for you or too progressive, and you'll struggle to use full travel on the trails. in which case you might want to think about removing a volume spacer from your fork or your shock. Most forks come with at least one volume spacer pre-installed, and shocks occasionally come with one or two as well. So to sum up, if your sag is correct, but you're using full travel too easily, the best thing is to add a volume spacer. If your sag's right and you're not using enough travel, you probably want to remove a volume spacer. But if you're not comfortable fitting volume spacers and you're bottoming out too easily, you might want to try just compromising a bit by setting less sag than you'd ideally want, say 25% instead of 30%, so that you get a firmer spring rate and it's harder to bottom out. So now that we've set the spring rate, it's really important to adjust the rebound to match the spring rate. The rebound damping controls how fast the fork and shock return to sag after being compressed. This needs to be set fast enough to react to high frequency bumps without being so fast as to give you a kind of bouncy ride. Getting the rebound right will give you the maximum amount of sensitivity and traction from your suspension. The easiest way to do this is to start with the rear shock. Start with the rebound set to its slowest setting. That means turning the red rebound dial fully clockwise until it stops. Find yourself a good sized curb. With the saddle dropped, ride in a seated position towards the curb at around walking pace. Then pay attention to how the suspension reacts after you go off the curb. With the rebound set to its slowest setting, the suspension will just gradually return to the sag position and then stay there. What you then want to do is repeat this test, speeding up the rebound by 1 click each time, that's turning it anti-clockwise, until the suspension no longer just returns to sag, but starts to overshoot sag slightly and then settle back down again. So what you're looking for is for the suspension to, instead of just coming up like this and settling at the sag point, to actually overshoot slightly and then settle down. And that's your ideal rebound setting. So with the fork, there's a slightly different trick to get the rebound just right. Again, what you want to do is start with the rebound at its slowest setting, so that's turning the red dial all the way clockwise. And then what you want to do is press on the fork, get it to use at least a third of its travel, and then release quite suddenly. Then keep repeating the test, adjusting 1 click at a time, until the front tyre starts to leave the ground when you release the handlebars. So as you can see, the fork is just starting to leave the ground now, and that means it's just a tiny bit too fast. So I'm going to turn it clockwise by 1 click just to slow it down a little bit, because what you're looking for is the fastest speed you can get away with before the tyre starts to hop off the ground, and that's the ideal rebound speed for the fork. Now that method works for hardtails as well, but if you've got a full suspension bike, there's one final check to do. What you want to do is roll along some flat ground once again and just bounce evenly on the suspension. And what you're looking for is that the front and rear suspension comes up together at the same rate. If one is coming up faster than the other, that's not what you want, especially if the rear is coming up faster than the front. That's going to cause you to get kind of bucked on jumps and stuff, and it's going to kind of pitch you towards the front on rough terrain. If anything, you want the fork to come up slightly faster than the shock. So if you're not sure, err on the side of making the fork a little faster than the shock. But basically what you're looking for is the suspension to feel balanced front to rear. So that's it, you're ready to hit the trails. It may still pay to do some fine tuning while you're out riding, but this method should get you most of the way there to your ideal suspension setup.